So we are moving into a book talk with Dr. Nathalie Edmond, who we were so privileged to have kick us off this morning. We welcome you back to speak. We welcome her back to speak about her recently published book, Mindful Race Talk, Building Literacy, Fluency, and Agility. In this important and insightful book, Dr. Edmond discusses practical strategies for centering racial justice and balancing compassion with accountability. For those who did not attend earlier sessions, she's a licensed clinical psychologist, experienced yoga teacher, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion practitioner, owner of a group practice, and former behavioral health administrator. She worked at the Counseling Center at Princeton University and is now director of counseling at Villanova University. Her new book draws from her extensive experience as a therapist and an educator. Please give another warm welcome to Dr. Edmond.
Thanks so much for letting me chat about my book. It's definitely 20 years in the making. So this is the book cover. So I'll tell you a little bit about the love and passion that I poured into this book. So I spent, I've graduated as a psychologist in 2003. And then I spent, basically the next 20 years being a trauma therapist. So dealing with all kinds of trauma, particularly relational trauma and complex PTSD, all of that shapes the way I think about the world. I became a yoga teacher about 10 years ago because trauma lives in the body. And I think, over the last decade, as I've gone deeper into anti-racism work, really understanding all of our racial conditioning, and in many ways, many of us are traumatized related to racial conditioning. So all of that lives in our bodies, and thinking about how we pass down intergenerational trauma. So what did our elders and our ancestors experience, and how did that shape their DNA, the ways that they learned to survive, the unresolved grief and wounding and rage that lives inside of all of them and lives in our society. And I think about all the years I've been an administrator and the ways I've created membership communities like Anti-Racism Revolution, because I wanted us to go deeper into conversations and creating sacred, protective spaces where people could play and explore and ask the questions that they feel shame about or frozen around. That was really important to me. And even the images, wanting the thought bubbles to be about all the ways we have thoughts swimming around in our head, right? Mindfulness research says we spend 60% of our life lost in thought, and wanting the images to represent different identities in our society. And I really wanted to make sure that one of the images was a Muslim presenting person, because I think that they can tend to be invisible in our society and dehumanized, and also wanting their stories to be part of the conversation. And because I'm always trying to challenge fat phobia, wanting the images to be of different body sizes. And so here's my table of contents, 24 chapters, and the book is divided into introduction, mindfulness foundations, which is a lot of what we kind of covered this morning in terms of psychologically grounding ourselves, because I think these conversations can activate so many things inside of us. And then part 2 is about, let's dive into racial literacy. Let's understand the wheel of power and privilege that I showed you. Let's understand our racial conditioning. How from before we were even born, did we already start to get conditioned around race? And let's do a power analysis. That's the agility we want to build, that we show up differently. We want to be allies and accomplices in different spaces, and that there's work to do, whether you are part of the global majority or racially minoritized, or if you are white presenting. And then the part 3 is integration and agility. So how do we take all of this and go and do something? And so why do I focus on race? Because I think that race is fundamental part of the fabric of the United States, Turtle Island, and that I want people to be able to really be clear about how race intersects with all justice movements, and that race is a really hard topic for we as a society to talk about in the United States because of all the unresolved racial trauma and the ongoing systems of oppression that exist. And that to whose benefit is it for us to heal from racial trauma? It's not usually the people in power. And so that's why the conferences like this that promote cross-racial solidarity are so important. So how do we hold multiple truths, compassion and accountability? Because I think sometimes in our national discourse, there is truth-telling, and it's not always compassionately based. It's sometimes dehumanizing. And so how do we hold people's full humanity while still holding them accountable for harm done, and believing that people can do better if they have the right support and if they choose to do better? So how do we start with agreements of how we're going to embody these values that we want to co-create in the world? And I want people to think about all the different mindfulness practices. I truly believe that there is a mindfulness practice for every single person. And so whether that's, we started the day with some loving kindness meditation. So, for me, that loving kindness meditation is really helpful. When I start to dehumanize other people or be irritated by other people, I try to find a way to wish them well as a way to just soften, not to ignore my feelings, but just as a way to soften a bit. Because I always, one of the signatures I have in my email is, may you sprinkle kindness wherever you go. And so wanting to feel my rage while also sprinkling it with kindness. And part of the mindfulness foundations is understanding our relationship to conflict. And that many of us grow up in families, cultures that don't help us explore what healthy conflict looks like. We might not even have models for healthy conflict. So one of the chapters is exploring your relationship to conflict. The book is really an opportunity for self-reflection. And I invite people to widen their window of tolerance and befriend their nervous system. So there's a chapter about mapping your nervous system, befriending your nervous system. Some of what we did earlier today, if you were there, around like how to think about when I'm in my window of tolerance or when I'm in sympathetic arousal or dorsal vagal arousal. What do I tend to be like, and how can I resource that? Because if we continue to have conversations about race and racism and white supremacy culture, it's going to get activating. Our fight, flight, collapse, fawn, freeze responses will get activated. And thinking about all the different institutions we've interacted with throughout our whole life, how did they shape our racial conditioning, from our parents to our religion to our school to the media, all of that stuff. And looking at those wheels of power and privilege, and really thinking about which identities do we hold that have more proximity to privilege and power, and which ones are more marginalized, and which ones do we weight heavier than others, because not all the images on that wheel of power and privilege have the same weight in our society. Some are invisible, some are really visible, some we choose to disclose, some get assigned to us. And then thinking about what's the anti-racism continuum. I think a lot about continuums as a starting point. A lot of it is circular, but like when I think of a continuum, right, it's helpful for me to be more interpersonally effective by gauging where I think the other person in the conversation is on their journey. So I might not use the phrase white supremacy culture in a conversation with someone who is like done barely any examination around race in our society, because immediately they're going to think KKK, they're going to distance, it's going to disconnect, right? Versus someone who's been coming to trainings for a number of years or a while, or has read some of the books, like me in white supremacy culture or my grandmother's hands, then I might talk about it a little bit differently, because I think about how I don't want to activate their threat response. And again, it's not me caretaking them, it's just me trying to be more effective. It's actually going to be more labor on my part for me to use like maybe my most accurate words if they are not even on the same plane with me, right? And so I'm trying to get on the same plane with people and helping them, move towards a deeper dialogue. Because I think if we lose people too early, maybe, if they're in that exhausted majority, maybe if we stayed with them a little longer, they might move, versus people on the extremes who are never going to get it, have no interest in getting it, and differentiating the two. I spend some time talking about racial microaggressions, and I kind of developed like 7 different categories of types of microaggressions, building on the work of other people. And the book is also a real credit to the many teachers I've had over the years, really wanting to credit all of them because there's so many amazing books out there that I think you all should read if you haven't already. And so the book really has lots of references for other books to read. And then how our brain love to go into binaries. And so I keep pulling people towards holding complexity, holding dialectics. And how do we get more interpersonally effective? So this comes from some of the work of dialectical behavior therapy, which is this idea that we are always evolving and adapting and co-creating the world. It's that, that change is inevitable and it's a constant. But also, how do I tailor what my conversation is? If the relationship is the most important thing, let's use this skill. If my self-respect is the most important thing, let's use this skill. If the objective is the most important thing, let's use this skill. And then I give examples of these different ways we can use these skills. And then I love this phrase, calling people forward, because I think that people calling out tends to be more shame-inducing. So I try to minimize that. That's usually, doing that in a public space. And sometimes that's necessary. Calling people in, I think it's good. But what I've learned in the last year is that sometimes people are trying to call me in, but what they're calling me in is like not moving us forward towards collective liberation, right? So, all of us could call people in, but someone who I see as overtly racist calling me into their paradigm, I'm not interested. But if you want to call me forward towards, a place where we're all humanized, everybody has bodily autonomy, everybody has dignity and enough to thrive, yay, I'm on board for that. So how do we call people forward towards a new paradigm? How do we decenter oneself? Because sometimes we get so caught up in our own feelings, we don't even realize we're centering ourselves, especially if we have privilege and power. And when we inevitably make mistakes, how do we do reparations? How do we ask for forgiveness? How do we do things, even if we're not going to get forgiveness, to try to repair the harm that has been done? And I think not enough people do reparations or address harm. So there's like 6 steps towards an effective apology that the research says. There's also a racial literacy quiz, which I think is great to think about, you have the literacy, but maybe not the fluency. Or maybe you have the fluency, but maybe not the agility. And I think of agility as you can adapt your style based on the context. You're not always using hammer. You're not always using any particular paradigm or words. You're really tailoring it. And then also we need joy, rest, and liberation. Balancing joy with rest and rest with effort. And also, how do we begin to see race in everyday life? Whether that's the educational system, the justice system, the nutrition system, the medical system, mental health spaces, everywhere, there's an opportunity for becoming more fluent and agile in our conversations about race. So I hope you'll check it out. I hope you'll reach out if you do read it. I'd love for there to be lots of book clubs and teams reading the book, because it's really my commitment that racial justice is a spiritual practice. So thank you all for listening to me, and I hope that it inspires you in the many ways you are doing good work out there in the world.
Thank you so much. Satyani, you have raised your hand. Go ahead and come on mic and ask a question. We have 1 minute before we start our next presentation.
Okay, well, this is not a small question, but in organizations where there are racial microaggressions, especially as a person of color, I really feel like people in white bodies need to do their own work, but yet and still, how can we as people of color who are receiving these microaggressions, how can we work with them in a way that is productive and healing for all parties involved?
Yeah. Well,
not a small question.
Yeah. I'm a strong advocate for racial affinity spaces, which I talk about in the book. And while there's a lot of, I think, race-based books that I think are centered around white people, this book is not centered around white people. It's centered around all people. So it's like, what's the work that racially minoritized people need to do? What's the work that white-bodied people need to do? And what are the tasks of the privileged versus the tasks of the minoritized?
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.